The sun had barely begun its slow climb over the endless plains of West Texas, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, when Sam Fletcher stirred awake. The middle-aged cowboy, whose once dark hair had now streaked with silver, sat on the edge of his creaking bed in the small wooden cabin he called home. He had lived here alone for 9 years, ever since the fire that took his family had left him with nothing but memories and a heart too heavy to bear company. Sam's cabin sat on a patch of land bordered by miles of open prairie. Cattle roamed in the distance, their low moans and the occasional whinny of horses the only music in his isolated world. He dressed quickly in worn denim jeans, a faded plaid shirt, and his trusted leather boots, their soles polished smooth from years of walking the same paths. Outside, frost still clung stubbornly to the wooden fences, tiny crystals catching the morning light like a scattering of diamonds. The cowboy's routine was simple, dictated by necessity and habit. He fed the horses, checked the fences, and made sure the water troughs weren't frozen solid. Each action, no matter how menial, had become a meditation, a way to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. 9 years of solitude had taught him patience, but it had also taught him suspicion. Sam hadn't trusted anyone since the fire, and the few townsfolk who passed by seldom lingered. He had no desire for idle conversation, nor did he crave companionship. As he led his horse, Dusty, out to the open pasture, the wind carried a chill that bit into his face. The plains were beautiful, in a harsh, unyielding way, but the beauty was a cruel reminder of the emptiness around him. Sam stopped mid-step, squinting toward the horizon. The sky was clear, but the wind whispered of a coming storm. He turned Dusty toward the barn, urging the animal into the warmth of the stall before returning to the cabin to light the stove. By midday, the temperature had dropped sharply. The wind whipped around the cabin, rattling the shutters and moaning through the cracks in the wooden walls. Sam sat at the small kitchen table, eating a simple meal of beans and bread, the fire crackling beside him. It was then that he heard it, a faint, hesitant tapping at the front door. Sam froze. His heart rate quickened slightly, a reflex from years of caution. Few traveled this far, and fewer still approached his cabin uninvited. He picked up his rifle, the worn wood familiar and comforting in his hands, and moved silently to the door. The knocking came again, soft but urgent. Peering through the small, grimy window, Sam saw a figure standing in the snow. A woman, her clothing ragged and damp, shivered violently. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her eyes, large, earnest, and weary, met his with a desperate plea. She carried nothing but a small, tattered blanket, which she clutched around her shoulders for warmth. Sam's first instinct was to turn away, to retreat into the safety of solitude. Yet something about the vulnerability in her eyes stopped him. He hesitated, then slowly unlocked the door. The wind swept in behind her, carrying the sharp bite of winter. She stepped inside, grateful but silent, her teeth chattering despite the blanket draped around her frail shoulders. "Name's Sam," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "What brings you here?" The woman's lips moved, but the words were soft, almost lost in the crackling of the fire he hurried to stoke. Finally, she managed, "Cold, please. Warmth, just for a while." Her accent was unfamiliar, the cadence of her speech hinting at a heritage long rooted in these lands before the white settlers had arrived. Sam recognized it immediately, Comanche. He studied her for a moment. Her clothes were simple, patched from wear. And her eyes held the hardness of someone who had survived more than her share of hardship. Yet beneath the resilience was a raw, human need, one he understood all too well. Sam stepped back, gesturing toward the fireplace. She moved closer, and he could see the frost on her eyelashes, the numbness in her fingers. Carefully, he helped her settle into the only chair near the warmth. He brought her a cup of water, then set to work tending the fire, each log cracking and hissing as it caught flame. She sipped the water slowly, her hands cupped around the metal, savoring the heat. For a while, neither spoke. Sam watched her silently, his eyes tracing the contours of her face, noting the faint scars along her cheek and jaw, evidence of a life that had demanded toughness. The wind outside howled like a restless spirit, but inside, the cabin was a sanctuary of quiet, if temporary, safety. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling, yet steady. "I have nowhere to go. The snow, too much." She paused, swallowing against the lump in her throat. "I walk, all day," and still, her gaze fell to the floor. Sam nodded, not fully understanding her words, yet understanding them entirely. He had spent nearly a decade in his own self-imposed exile, wandering the loneliness of his life like a ghost. And here was someone who, in a strange twist of fate, mirrored his own desperation. He gestured toward the corner bed. "You can stay. For tonight." Relief washed over her face like sunlight breaking through clouds. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, as snow fell thick and relentless against the cabin walls, Sam sat in his chair opposite hers. He could not recall the last time he had shared space with another human being for more than a fleeting moment. He listened as she slowly warmed, her fingers thawing, her breath easing into a rhythm free of shivers. Outside, the plains lay silent under a blanket of snow, stretching endlessly beyond the horizon. Inside, however, the fire's glow painted the cabin walls with flickering light, casting shadows that danced like memories. For the first time in years, Sam felt a crack in the walls of his self-imposed isolation. And though he did not yet know what the coming days would bring, he understood one thing clearly: life had a way of breaking through even the deepest solitude, sometimes in the form of a stranger's desperate plea for warmth. He glanced at her once more, noticing the faint tremor in her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, and something in his chest stirred, a long-forgotten sense of responsibility, of connection. For now, at least, the cold night had brought them together. The future remained uncertain, but in that moment, the cowboy who had lived alone for 9 years found a fragile hope flickering like the fire between them. And so, the long, quiet winter night settled over the prairie, and two strangers, bound by circumstance, sat together, one seeking warmth, the other slowly remembering the warmth he had long denied himself. The first light of dawn seeped through the frost-streaked windows, painting the cabin in soft oranges and yellows. Sam Fletcher stirred from his chair, his eyes adjusting to the dim glow of embers still flickering in the hearth. The Comanche woman was already awake, sitting quietly on the wooden chair, wrapped in the small blanket that had been her only shield against the cold night. She stirred at the sound of him moving, and for a moment, their eyes met. Neither spoke, but there was a quiet acknowledgement between them, a recognition that they had survived the night together. Sam rose and moved to the small kitchen corner to prepare breakfast. He was used to doing everything himself, tending the fire, cooking, and feeding the horses, but now, for the first time in nearly a decade, he was aware of another presence. He put some water to boil for coffee, heated a skillet, and stirred the beans he had soaked overnight. She watched quietly, her gaze drifting to the frost outside, her hands still wrapped around the blanket. Finally, she spoke. You live here alone." Her voice was soft, but the words carried curiosity. Sam nodded, stirring the beans absent-mindedly. 9 years. No one comes by. No one stays long. Mostly just the wind, or the cattle. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "It must be hard." "Depends on how you see it," Sam replied, his voice low. "Hard, or peaceful. I've learned to make it both." The woman nodded, as if understanding entirely. She stood and moved toward the door, pausing briefly. "I can help," she said. "If you let me. Feed the horses, fix the fence, anything." Sam considered her offer. He had been alone for so long that letting someone share the burden of daily life felt strange, even uncomfortable. But something in her eyes told him she had endured hardship far beyond the cold Texas winters. Perhaps she was trustworthy, or at least desperate enough to need work. He gestured toward the door. "Outside then. Start with the horses." By the time the sun had fully risen, the prairie was alive with activity. Sam and the woman, whose name he learned was Aiyana, moved together and practiced silence. She fed the horses, brushing their winter coats with careful hands, while Sam checked the fences, replacing broken boards and tightening loose nails. Occasionally, she glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her dark eyes. He noticed how naturally she moved around the animals, her gestures precise and confident, like someone who had grown up in the open lands. "Where are you from?" Sam asked during a brief pause, leaning against a post to catch his breath. "West of here, near the river," she said. Her gaze drifted to the distant hills. "I was alone." Then, she trailed off, biting her lip, and Sam did not press. He knew some stories were best shared when the teller was ready. The day passed quickly, filled with work and quiet companionship. Aiyana moved easily through the tasks, mending fences, carrying firewood, and even preparing a small lunch from the supplies in the cabin. Sam watched her, noting the small ways she brought life to the cabin, the careful attention she'd paid to details he had long ignored. She seemed to notice the subtle sounds of the prairie, the distant call of a hawk, the soft rustle of the cattle, the whispering wind, and in doing so, she reminded him of the world beyond his self-imposed isolation. By late afternoon, the wind picked up again, sweeping across the open plains in sharp gusts. Sam returned to the cabin with a heavy log for the fire, and Aiyana was already inside, tending to the hearth. The warmth of the fire mingled with the faint scent of wood smoke, creating a comfort Sam had not known he missed. "You should rest," he said, setting the log in the hearth. "It's been a long day." "I will," she replied, kneeling near the fire to warm her hands. "But you should eat. You've done more work than me today." Sam chuckled softly. "That's what I do. But, thank you." They ate a simple meal together, beans, bread, and coffee, but the presence of another human made it feel like more than sustenance. Conversation flowed in small bursts, hesitant but genuine. She asked about his life before the cabin, and he told her stories of the cattle drives, of his lost family, and the fire that had left him alone. She listened without judgment, nodding or murmuring softly, as if acknowledging both the pain and the survival in his story. As night fell, a storm moved in from the west, bringing sleet and gusting wind. The cabin shuddered under the force of the storm, but inside, there was a fragile sense of safety. Sam watched Aiyana as she sat near the fire, her face lit by the flames. She had removed the wettest layers of her clothes, drying slowly, and the small movements of her hands, brushing hair from her face, reminded him how long it had been since he had seen another person simply exist beside him. "Will you stay?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet, almost afraid to break the firelight's spell. Sam paused. The question hung in the air, heavier than the storm outside. He had never considered letting someone stay, truly stay, in his life. But watching her, seeing the trust and courage it had taken for her to come to him, he felt an answer forming that he hadn't expected. "For now," he said. "At least until the storm passes." Aiyana's face relaxed into a soft smile, relief visible in her posture. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, sleep came differently than it had in years. Sam lay in the corner bed, listening to the rhythmic breathing of another human nearby, a sound he had forgotten existed in his world. The storm raged on outside, yet the cabin felt like a fortress, a place of warmth and shared survival. He realized, for the first time in nearly a decade, that solitude was not the same as peace. Perhaps true peace was found not in isolation, but in connection, in shared struggles, and in the quiet knowledge that someone else had chosen to trust you. Over the next few days, a rhythm formed. Sam and Aiyana worked together on the farm, sharing duties and exchanging glances that spoke more than words. She brought new life to the cabin, arranging small personal touches, organizing supplies, and even repairing worn furniture. He, in turn, showed her how to read the sky, track the herd, and handle the stubborn cattle that roamed the prairie. Through shared labor, laughter began to find its way into the cabin. Aiyana's stories of her childhood, of life on the river plains, brought lightness to the quiet space. Sam found himself listening, smiling more often than he had in years, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the walls of his isolation began to crumble. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Sam and Aiyana stood outside, surveying the land. The wind had calmed, leaving only a gentle rustle of prairie grass. Sam watched her, noting the way the light kissed her face, and realized that the cabin, the land, and even the winter storm had brought them together not just by chance, but by necessity. "We make a good team," he said finally, his voice soft but firm. She smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I think so too. But don't get used to it, I'm a hard worker, not a guest." Sam laughed, the sound carrying across the open plains, mingling with the distant calls of the cattle. It was a sound of life returning, of human connection rediscovered. And so, the days passed in shared labor and quiet companionship. The cabin, once a refuge of solitude, became a home of cautious trust and budding friendship. Sam, the cowboy who had lived alone for 9 long years, began to understand that life, even in the harshest of landscapes, held room for warmth, for laughter, and for the unexpected arrival of someone who could change everything with a simple plea for shelter. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the Texas plains. The heavy snow melted into slushy puddles, the ice receding from the water troughs, and the prairie grass began to show hints of green beneath the thawing earth. Inside the cabin, Sam Fletcher and Aiyana had settled into a quiet rhythm. The routines that had once been solitary, feeding horses, repairing fences, tending fires, were now shared tasks. The presence of another human had transformed the cabin from a lonely refuge into a place alive with life. Sam watched Aiyana as she worked, her hands deftly arranging firewood near the hearth. The way she moved, confident, yet gentle, reminded him of someone who had known hardship but had survived it with grace. She glanced at him and smiled, a small gesture that made his chest tighten. He had grown accustomed to silence, but her presence had taught him that shared quiet could be comforting, even sacred. The cowboy and the Comanche woman had begun to speak more openly, their conversations weaving between survival, stories of the past, and dreams for the future. Aiyana shared memories of the river plains where she had grown up, of her family and her tribe, of life before she had been forced to wander alone. Sam listened, sometimes offering advice, sometimes simply nodding. He felt a growing respect for her resilience. "You have a way with the land," Aiyana said one morning, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear as she inspected the cattle. "I've never seen someone live so well alone, though I can see why 9 years might make you wary of others." Sam chuckled softly. "Wary? That's putting it lightly. I've been alone for nearly a decade. I didn't know anyone could just walk into my life and change it." He paused, watching the horses graze in the distance. "But I suppose it happens." Aiyana's gaze softened. "It does. Sometimes, it takes a storm, or a stranger, to remind us we're not meant to be completely alone." Her words lingered with him. 9 years of solitude had left him cautious, guarded, and at times bitter. But Aiyana's presence had begun to melt that bitterness. She brought warmth not only to the cabin but to his heart, a warmth he had believed he would never feel again. The days passed in a comfortable rhythm, but the bond between them deepened beyond mere companionship. Sam found himself watching her more often than necessary, noting the small habits she had, how she hummed quietly when she worked, how her hands moved with precision, how she paused occasionally to gaze out at the prairie. And he noticed that when she spoke, her voice carried a calm authority, tempered by kindness. One afternoon, as the sun hung low in the sky, they worked together repairing a fence along the northern pasture. The wind had softened, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and budding grass. Sam hammered a post into place while Aiyana secured the wire, their movements synchronized, their unspoken communication as natural as breathing. "You know," Aiyana said, pausing to wipe sweat from her brow, "I never thought I'd find someone like you in a place this vast and lonely." Sam stopped mid-hammer swing, considering her words. "I never thought anyone would come looking for me," he admitted quietly. "Not in all these years." She smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Life has a strange way of surprising us. Sometimes, it throws people together who need each other, even if they don't realize it at first." By the time the fence was repaired, the sky had turned a brilliant hue of orange and pink. Sam and Aiyana stood side by side, surveying their work, the prairie stretching endlessly beyond them. The wind whispered through the grass, carrying the distant calls of the cattle, and Sam felt a quiet contentment he had never known. That evening, they returned to the cabin, where Aiyana had already prepared a modest supper. The fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. They ate in companionable silence, the sounds of the prairie outside blending with the crackle of the fire. After the meal, Sam brought out an old, worn guitar he had rarely touched in the years of solitude. He strummed a few chords, hesitant at first, then more confidently as Aiyana listened, humming along softly. The music filled the cabin, mingling with the warmth of the fire and the comfort of shared presence. As night fell, the prairie was bathed in silver moonlight, the snow-free ground glistening like frost in the early morning. Sam and Aiyana stepped outside for a moment, feeling the crisp air against their faces. The world seemed vast and unending, yet in that moment, it felt small enough to hold them both. "You've changed this place," Sam said quietly, his eyes on the distant horizon. "It's no longer just a cabin, or a refuge. It feels like home." Aiyana's hand brushed his, tentative but deliberate. "Home is wherever you find safety, and someone who cares," she replied softly. For the first time in years, Sam did not feel the weight of solitude pressing against his chest. He felt hope, fragile but undeniable. The winter that had brought them together had also brought healing, healing for his loneliness, and perhaps, for hers. Over the following weeks, the prairie began to bloom under the early signs of spring. Wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, and the cattle grazed on fresh grass. Sam and Aiyana continued their work, their bond deepening with each shared task, each story told, each quiet moment by the fire. The cabin was no longer just wood and stone, it was a place of trust, laughter, and growing love. One evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the land, Sam and Aiyana stood together on the porch. The wind was gentle, carrying the sweet scent of new growth. Sam reached for her hand, and she took it without hesitation, their fingers intertwining. "I never believed I'd find this, not after all these years," Sam said, his voice low but steady. "Neither did I," Aiyana admitted, squeezing his hand. "But sometimes, the right person comes when you least expect it." They stood in silence, watching the prairie stretch out before them, vast and endless, yet no longer lonely. The cowboy who had lived alone for 9 years had found warmth, trust, and companionship in a woman who had come seeking shelter. The cabin, once a refuge of isolation, had become a home of shared life and quiet love. As night settled over the plains, they returned inside, the fire casting a golden glow over the wooden walls. They sat together, side by side, knowing that whatever storms might come, they would face them together. The world outside remained wild and unpredictable, but within the cabin, they had found something steadfast: connection, understanding, and hope. And so, the middle-aged cowboy and the Comanche woman began a new chapter of their lives. One built on resilience, trust, and the quiet knowledge that even in the harshest landscapes, warmth could be found. Sometimes, it arrived in the form of a stranger knocking at the door, seeking shelter from the cold, and sometimes, it stayed, turning a house into a home, and two solitary hearts into companions for life.